Hi everybody. In this video, I would like to go over some of the main points of Christine Korsgaard's Kant formula of universal law. The first formulation of the categorical imperative says, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. A few lines later, Kant says that this is all equivalent to acting as though your maxim were to become, by your will, a law of nature. But how do you determine if you can will a given maxim as a law of nature? This question is about what you can will without contradiction. A maxim is a subjective principle, a rule that you give yourself, like, I will do such and such in order to obtain so and so. In this paper, Korsgaard argues for a particular interpretation of this contradiction. What I would really like for you to get out of this paper is a clear understanding of what her interpretation is, which is the practical contradiction interpretation, and also a little bit about the teleological contradiction interpretation. This should simplify what you want to take out of this paper. The preferred interpretation for Korsgaard is called the practical contradiction interpretation. On page 500, she says of this interpretation that your maxim would be self-defeating if universalized under the practical contradiction. This is the practical contradiction interpretation of what it means for a universalized maxim to lead to a contradiction and thus make it impossible for you to do your action. So this is how you tell what is right and wrong. If it leads to a contradiction, if a maxim of your act leads to a contradiction, then the act is wrong. If it does not lead to a contradiction, the act is right. Your maxim would be self-defeating if universalized under this, if it leads to a contradiction. Your action would become ineffectual for the achievement of your purpose if everyone tried to use it for that purpose, and I'll give an example in a moment. Since you propose to use that action for the purpose, at the same time as you propose to universalize that action, sorry, let me read that again. Since you propose to use that action for that purpose at the same time as you propose to universalize the maxim, you in effect will be thwarting, you in effect will the thwarting of your own purpose. In other words, you will something that you can't. You will thwart your own purpose. You will prevent your own purpose if you will that act, according to this practical interpretation. Practical contradiction leads to a practical contradiction. An example of this would be false promising. The person who needs money and is considering lying to get it reasons as follows. Since I need money and I can get it by falsely promising to get it back, I should do so. So the maxim of the proposed act might be, whenever I can get myself out of difficulties by a false promise, I should do so. Now I have two things, my proposed act and a maxim of my act. Next, I reason whether I can consistently perform my act if this maxim were at the same time a universal law of nature. So I say to myself, if everyone made false promises to get themselves out of difficulties, would I be able to tell a lie to get money in the present case? The practical contradiction interpretation would run as follows. In a world where everyone lied to get out of difficulties, the whole practice of truth-telling would fall apart. The state of the world would make it impossible for me to lie to get money in my own case, because nobody would believe me. So I would not be able to carry off my proposed action. This is a practical contradiction because the action concerns my practical affairs. Korsgaard makes some very good arguments for this interpretation of what Kant says, though there are some good counter-arguments as well. One of them that we'll look at here is that the practical contradiction interpretation doesn't work as well as the teleological contradiction interpretation in explaining Kant's view of the wrongness of suicide. The word telos, by the way, means purpose. The suicidal person asks, what if everyone who became deeply unhappy were to end their lives? Now, this would be an incredibly unhappy state of affairs, but it doesn't seem to make the act a practical impossibility. Now, just let me underline that again. For the utilitarian, perhaps, the wrongness of the act of suicide is because it would lead to unhappiness. This is not the case with Kantian ethics. With Kantian ethics, the wrongness of suicide, or with anything, is if it leads to a contradiction of some sort in willing a maxim of the act to be universal law. Okay? However, a universalized maxim leads to a contradiction according to the teleological contradiction interpretation. When the maxim is inconsistent with a systemic harmony of purposes, or with the principle that any organ, instinct, or action type has a natural purpose for which it must be the one best suited. So the person considering ending his or her life wants to do so in order to feel better, essentially proposing to end his or her life from the same motive as nature has given humans to prolong it. So it's inconsistent with a harmony of purposes. That is the idea that we are given by nature natural instincts for certain particular purposes. And the idea that Kant is getting at here is that the instinct motivation to feel good is there in order to prolong our lives. This is what the natural reason for feeling good is there for. It's to keep us living. So if I was to use that same motivation to end my life because I wanted to feel better, that would go against this harmony of purposes. So it's a sort of purpose-laden contradiction. It's the teleological, think of purpose, it's a purpose contradiction. So it's an interpretation of Kant that says that that's what the contradiction leads to, and that's what he meant. Now, of course, in the paper, Korsgaard discusses that Kant wasn't extremely clear about which interpretation, if there was any one in particular that he favored. There seems to be textual evidence for 3 different interpretations. So she wants to argue that the practical contradiction interpretation of what he meant by contradiction was the right one. But the teleological contradiction interpretation seems to work better with cases of ending one's life. In other words, feeling good and avoiding suffering excuse me, is something that life has given us for the purpose of prolonging our life, not ending it. So for the purpose of prolonging our life, not ending it. The person in agony wants to use this same feeling to do the reverse of what its purpose is. It's telos. So the teleological contradiction interpretation seems to work best with this example. Now, the third option that Korsgaard discusses, the logical contradiction interpretation, works well with a couple of other examples that she gives, but we won't go into them here. Excuse me. I hope that this video has helped you in understanding this very interesting article. Thank you.